back to 37th and the World, the flagship podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. I'm Anwen Williams, and today we're joined by Stephen Orlins, the president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. He has critical experience in the realm of U.S. China relations, dating back to his work with the initial establishment of diplomatic relations in the 1970s. So, to get us started today, President Orlins, could you please share a little bit about your experience working with U.S. China representatives in the 1970s?
Well, in the 1970s, I was in the legal advisor in the U.S. Department of State, and I was very young. Well, this entire experience occurred before I was age 30. So when I graduated from Harvard Law School, I went into the State Department, was initially put into political military affairs, which made no sense for somebody who spoke fluent Chinese. And then a year later, President Carter was elected, and Richard Holbrooke, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, asked me to join what was called the Assistant Legal Advisor's Office for East Asian Pacific Affairs. The good news is, I was so young, I didn't understand the importance of what I was doing. I just said, well, this is my job. This is what I'm supposed to do. Obviously, now that I look back at it decades and decades later, I understand how incredibly important that work was. What was so interesting about it, and it's a lesson which I have kept over these many years, was presidential leadership. I was the lowest of the lowest level person. So when President Carter said something, he said it to Secretary Brzezinski, who said it to Secretary Vance, who said it to Deputy Secretary Christopher, who said it to Richard Holbrooke, who said it to me. So I was many levels removed from this. But he said, this is in America's interest, and we're going to do it because it's the right thing for America. The polling tells us, that the polling on China was very anti-establishment of diplomatic relations. So when we did the work, they said, okay, you have to understand, you're going to be attacked. Well, I was a whopping 27 years old. I didn't know what being attacked by the Senator of the House was. So when we established diplomatic relations, it was great. It was celebratory. And then when my boss, Herb Hansel, went to testify, he was just reamed by the Senate. He was called a traitor. He was told he had sold out American interests. And I was just this, you don't sit in the front row when you're the 27-year-old, you sit in the back row. So I sat behind him going, oh my God, this is terrible. But in fact, Carter, Brzezinski, Vance, Christopher, Holbrooke, Hansel, they all stood firm. They said, this is in America's interests. And they overtook the anti-China forces in the executive branch, in the media, and in another place. And that has been true over many, many years, whether, it was Reagan, Bush, Clinton, on and on. The president needs to lead and needs to some degree, overrule those who have a more parochial interest. So that lesson I learned when I was young, and I have relearned it time and time again.
That's very insightful. Thank you for sharing. And you talk a little bit about the backlash and how you maybe didn't understand how severe it would be initially. But apart from that, were there any other unexpected challenges that you faced during this time?
Well, we expected the backlash. We did. So President Carter instructed me and Herb Hansel to meet with folks who we knew would be in opposition to the establishment of diplomatic relations. So without telling them we were going to do it, we explained to them the structure that we were going to use to protect Taiwan. So it wasn't unexpected. It was expected, but it was very severe. So, as a kid, now if I get criticized, I kind of go, whatever. But when you're 27 years old, you're right out of law school, you feel intense pressure when you get that kind of criticism. I think one of the kind of peculiar yet incredibly educational parts of the establishment of diplomatic relations. So President Carter gave this instruction. It was extremely tightly held. So the number of people who were working on this was very, very few. So I always used to joke, and I couldn't tell anybody what I was working on. I would used to say there were a lot of chiefs, so there were a lot of bigwigs who would make these decisions. But in terms of implementing it, there was virtually nobody. So I was literally the scribe for a bunch of stuff. So I got what I thought was just a heavy workload. In retrospect, was played a much more significant role than a 27-year-old should play. Now that it's like 27, my experience had been, a gap year between college and law school, and then my time in political military affairs. But I would not what you would be called a an experienced lawyer. So the great part was they gave me all this experience. They trusted me. I had great bosses in Richard Holbrooke and in Berg Hansel. I mean, they were fabulous. I can remember when I would, so it would be unusual. My title was attorney advisor. So for you to brief a deputy secretary of state was like, the Chinese would say the GBA wasn't right. The ranking wasn't correct. So I would go in and brief and then I would be excused because they would talk about things which were too important for somebody of my level. But then Herb or Holbrook, Herb Hansel or Richard Holbrook would come and they say, Steve, you did a great job. So they would come and seek me out and give me the encouragement that you need to give to a young lawyer. So it was terrific. What a wonderful experience. And you know, better to be lucky than smart.
Better to be lucky than smart. But since then, you have stayed in the US China realm and made massive contributions. So, looking a little bit at your current work and your experiences, how do you believe that the US and China could look to maintain a mutually beneficial relationship in today's political climate?
Well, I'm probably a political minority, but I don't believe they should maintain a mutually beneficial relationship. They should increase a mutually beneficial relationship. So what I believed from the time I wrote my thesis, my history thesis in college till today, that a beneficial U.S.-China relationship benefits the American people, that the American people and the Chinese people, but I'm focusing on the American people, get enormous benefits from a constructive relationship. So folks kind of, I don't want to single out Georgetown, folks within the Beltway are always looking at the security elements. We in New York, in the Midwest, in the far West, are looking at how does the relationship benefit us? So anything from uh, an energy company to a soybean farmer to an importer, these folks see the benefits from this constructive relationship. So what I hope going forward happens is that the U.S. recognizes these benefits, that the Chinese recognize these benefits, and we increase the interaction. Anything from students to trade to investment to cultural interactions, you name it. We find ways to increase this because these really benefit the peoples on both sides. What we often lose sight of as we focus on the security aspect is, hey, if we had a better relationship in cancer research, well, maybe, my sister just died. Yeah, she was taking a Chinese drug. Unfortunately, it didn't work and she died. But my great hope is that cooperation in the future in areas like that allow Americans to live longer, allow Americans to have more healthy lives, allow Chinese to live longer, allow Chinese to have healthier lives. And when that becomes, it's already provable, when that becomes accepted by large numbers of Americans, it will be a percolate up. The American people will be telling the American government, we need a more constructive relationship because that will make our lives better. Today, as is always the case, I was on a broken subway in New York City. I take the subway to work. and it broke down, as it breaks down on most days. And last week, I had to go to D.C., and Amtrak broke down. So it was just a mess. When I go to China, trains and the subways are so effective, so efficient. So my hope had always been that Chinese technology could come to the United States to help rebuild these subway systems, rebuild these rail systems, and make the lives of ordinary Americans better. So the folks in DC are focused on the security. Well, most of them don't ride the New York subways. Some take Amtrak to New York, but most don't. So they don't recognize how deeply broken American infrastructure is and how much Chinese support could help improve this. I used to have a dream that that would happen. Now the politics have unfortunately made it much more difficult. But I'll continue to work towards that end. I'll continue to try and get Chinese capital into the United States to do that. I'll continue to try and get American capital into China to improve their systems. There's so much that we can do together that it breaks my heart that security dominates all of these discussions.
I agree. And I think being in DC, you hear a lot of the security, the economic, the tensions and hostility. So my next question kind of takes a look at that political sphere. I mean, clearly in the current administration, there is a lot of this sense of hostility. Do you think there's also a well-developed comprehension of the Chinese viewpoint and potential avenues for cooperation? Or do the tensions kind of overshadow other opportunities for understanding and cooperation?
I think there's, well, I think the U.S. government's view is not unipolar. So there are those, I think, the president and others who believe that a constructive relationship can benefit the American people. So since the April meeting, you've seen increase in American agricultural exports. I think we're beginning to see the increase. We're beginning to see energy exports. We've seen the H-200 now being exported to China. We've seen China relax its rules on rare earths. We're seeing stuff, and maybe because President Trump has a very realistic view of the kind of threat that China poses. And maybe we'll begin to see Chinese investment come into the United States. We'll see increased American investment into China, in the healthcare sector and other sectors, which can benefit both China and the United States. But right now, there is a tension. Uh, when the president decides stuff, it gets followed through on. So if he opines, okay, I think the Chinese EV companies should come to the United States to set up joint ventures with American automotive factories, that's going to happen. When the president opines, if he doesn't opine, the folks beneath the president are not particularly pro-constructive engagement. So if they're left to their own devices, we won't see enormous progress. But if the president opines, and my guess is leading up to and during the president's visit, we'll see some progress. And then if there is progress in April, we hopefully will see progress before President Xi visits here in November, December, before the G20, and if President Trump goes or APEC in China. And then hopefully we'll have a bilateral summit. And gets back to the first point I made in our discussion. In my experience, presidential leadership matters a lot. That if the president, so President Carter told us, this is in America's interest. Yeah, I didn't know what was in America's interest. I was a little kid, but I followed him with I implemented what he asked us to do. Um, there, there wasn't tension within the administration that Brzezinski, there was tension but among personalities, but not over policy. So, Brzezinski, Oxenberg, uh, Cy Vance, Warren Christopher, Richard Holder, Herb Hansel. There wasn't tension over policy. There was tension over who would take credit for us, who would be out front, who would meet with Deng Xiaoping. When I shook Deng Xiaoping's hand on the White House lawn, in early 1979. You know, there's a lot of tension of who would be at that. So we, the lower level folks in the State Department, got to stand outside in a group, which I thought, fine, that's great. I didn't care who went to the White House dinner. I didn't care who got the beam done, but they all did, and they thought about it.
Then I guess when you were quite young when all of that happened, and even now, the National Committee on U.S. China Relations still has several programs that are focused on young professionals and more youth engagement. So I guess looking towards that, the Public Intellectuals Program and the U.S. China People's Dialogue, these focus on a people to people connection and exchange. In times of both U.S. China peace and U.S. China extreme tension, how do you see these kinds of programs factoring in and adapting to ongoing situations?
That's so interesting that during times of tension, these programs are actually more important. So, you know, number one, the need to have interactions when government is not having interactions is more and more important. Number two, a lot of these programs are focused on the next generation. And the committee has for many, many years been committed to fostering understanding amongst the next generation of China scholars and the public. So something we have a young leaders forum, which are folks who don't know China, who meet with young leaders from China, and they interact. The public intellectuals program now is 140 uh, professors from all over the United States who we commit to bringing them to Washington, to meeting with think tanks, government, the Congress, and others. So they kind of understand the political structure that they're dealing with. And then we bring them to China. They meet with MOFA, MOFCOM, Ministry of National Defense, FAGAIWei, all these other um, organizations within the Chinese government, because many live in an ivory tower, that they're not dealing with the reality. And we bring them from, you know, the far south to the northeast to the far west to the Midwest. So if you look at on our website is a list of those scholars, and they're from all over. And it's part of our strong commitment to the next generation. And whether the relationship is tense or the relationship is not tense, we're committed to those. If you look at when those programs started, they started at a time when the relationship was not tense. And we've persevered with these programs as tensions have increased. Our people to people dialogue is just the foundation of the committee. So you go back to ping pong diplomacy. I mean, ping pong diplomacy well, Amman. You've heard it from your family. I hope they have talked about how terrible the U.S. China relationship was in 1971. We characterize each as demons, that there was nothing good about the relationship. Then suddenly, the U.S. ping pong team goes to China in 1971, and that begins the change. And then the Chinese ping pong team comes to the United States, and all of a sudden, Americans who used to be so critical of Chinese say, hey, these kids ain't bad. They're good sports. They're good ping pong players. There's a real country there. That this characterization of the Chinese government, of the Chinese Communist Party as evil is not helpful to America. So that began the change. And then this is the 60th anniversary of the National Committee. On our 60th anniversary, we continue to emphasize the people to people relationship and continue to advocate for increased people to people exchange. One of the disappointments of my tenure at the committee is in the first years, we saw Chinese students in the United States rise significantly. We saw, albeit at a much, much lower level, American students in China rise precipitously up to almost 15,000, Chinese up to almost 400,000. And now we've seen it almost fall off a cliff. We have 270,000 Chinese students in the United States. In China, we have less than 2,000, maybe less than 1,000 American students. And that, for me, is a huge disappointment. I still love going to universities all over the United States and talking to the Chinese students and hearing what their concerns are. And for years, when I would, when I get criticized for being too pro constructive engagement, I would go to universities and they would kind of refuel my fuel tank. I would say, oh, look, this is the future. We're going to be fine.
I agree with the importance of universities. I think even in a lot of my lessons, we're talking about, are people going to study abroad to China? Is there a general concern about going overseas to China to study abroad? And it's definitely a topic at hand in universities today. But to wrap us up today, you
Well,
talk a
you
lot.
encourage the people to go to.
I will. I've been in Beijing and I love the campuses, I love the spaces.
It's so important.
Yeah.
There was so CCTV was doing an interview, and we were talking about this, very much the way that you and I are talking about it. And I didn't, I then saw the broadcast, and they had a very interesting script at the bottom of the broadcast, and it said, 下一个欧伦斯在哪? Where is the next Steve Orlins? And if you kids don't go to China to study and live the way I did, it's going to be tough to have a next Steve Orlins.
That's very insightful. Thank you for sharing that. That's interesting. And looking at your time with the National Committee, looking at your experience overseas in China, speaking in the United States, do you think that surprisingly, in the realm of U.S. China relations, any certain factor or any certain area has actually stayed relatively constant? Or has it always been kind of constantly changing and in flux?
It's it's cyclical. So, it's interesting. I'm having to speak at the memorial service for my mentor from Harvard Law School, Jerome Cohen, who really was a giant in the field. And he and I were best friends for 55 years. So an amazing period of time. And in his final years, he used to always say, I mean, I saw him every Sunday night for dinner. And he would always say, never forget that China and U.S. China relations are cyclical, and that China will change and the United States will change. And don't deal with China or U.S. China relations as if it is static, that it's in a state of constant flux. And you really need to remember that. And what troubles me so about people not going to China now is they don't see the change. When I was with the broken Amtrak last week, I was in Washington and I'm talking to people. And she said, when was the last time you were in China? Oh, 2017, 2018. I said, have you seen the Xiaomi factories? Have you seen the CATL factories? Have you seen the wind turbines? It's another world. You have to go there and see it for yourself and experience it. Waiting for a car. And my friend calls his car on his iPhone and drives up without a driver. And I go, wow. Yeah, we have a little bit. We have Waymo, we have those things, but it's nothing like this. Just common practice. I'm going to a factory that's a dark factory that has a cell phone factory that has effectively zero employees. It's all robots and others. You got to see it for yourself. And you understand that we need to cooperate, because if we cooperate, it's going to be one and one makes three. If it's one, separate by one, it's going to be one and a half. And it's a loss for the American people, and it's a loss for the Chinese people. And I hope that the executive branch, the congressional branch, the media, and the people in both countries recognize that.
Thank you. That was a wonderful analysis, and I completely agree with having to go there and see it for yourself. This was a wonderful discussion, and I truly appreciate the insights and perspectives that you shared today. For all of our listeners, if you want to learn more about President Orlins and his work, please visit the NCUSCR website. And President Orlins, thank you again so much.
Amen. Thanks for doing.
This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast's description that says support the show. To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out GJIA.georgetown.edu.